I'm sure many of you remember 2020, right? This is when, in the wake or in the midst of a pandemic, everyday, ordinary folks took to the streets to protest in the name of Black Lives Matter, calling for racial justice and an attention to social inequalities. As with any good social movement, it was not relegated to the streets, right? We saw companies and organizations take up the mantle of Black Lives Matter to change their organizations to address these issues of racial inequality and social justice. Shortly after, not long, probably like a year later, folks started to raise the question, did these movements matter? Did the protests of 2020 matter, right? Did we see any changes? Well, those questions are rooted in really thinking about structural changes, because we all know that there has been some changes since the 2020 protests. But have we seen the type of structural changes that the movement was calling for, right? Structural changes about how do we get to the root of the issue. And I would say part of this problem with this type of structural change has to do with leadership. People believe that if we were going to see the type of structural changes in our organization, it was going to take a type of bold and progressive leadership to make it happen. Well, I would argue that leadership might be part of the problem. Oftentimes when we think about leadership as this type of neutral characteristic or quality, in the sense that you can use leadership to create change in a positive direction, or you can use leadership to create change in a negative direction, but leadership itself is kind of this neutral agency. Well, that's not exactly true. Leadership itself is rooted in a certain historical and political paradigm, right? Most of you might have heard of the idea of the great man theory of leadership, right? This is the idea that is rooted in a type of Eurocentric, capitalist, patriarchal framework of how we think about leadership. Now, I will admit, 2020, even 2022, we have come far from this kind of great man theory. We have definitely come to diversify this idea of leadership. However, we still see some remnants of this ideas that carry over in our politics and in the way that we think about leadership today, such as this reliance on individualism, this idea around control, and also economic exploitation and hierarchy, right? And so when we look at progressive movements, we've seen anti-racist feminists really push back on the idea of the use of leadership. Right? We have people like Ella Baker who said strong people don't need strong leaders, right? And so this is why I believe leadership is not enough. If we're trying to create the type of structural changes that get to the root causes of issues, we need to go beyond leadership. Oftentimes when we focus on leadership, we put an emphasis on results. And when we put those emphasis on results, it usually means that we take shortcuts. We take a more individualistic approach to change. We do more symbolic gestures that mask the structural needs and results, right? So think about what has happened since those referendums of the 2020, right? We've seen the Great Resignation. We've seen quiet quitting. We've seen even some of these organizations that were taking the progressive stand. We've seen their workers organize to create unions for rights. Right? And so if we're going to focus on social justice goals, then we have to also focus on social justice oriented relationships in the here and now. And so I believe that social justice oriented relationships help us to do that. Now, I know that does not sound as sexy as leadership, and it is a mouthful, but I think it helps us to get to the point. One, it brings our attention back to the process. How do we go about creating change, right? It forces us to ask this question of what do we do in the in-between time? How do we create equitable relationships as we go, right? We can't wait until we get to the promised land to then become all equitable, right? We have to do it as we go. And so this really brings us back to the point that was inherent within the Black Lives Matter movement, this idea of a grounded futurism, right? Which really means that it is in the making, right? What we do as we trying to create change, that we actually get a glimpse into what the future may hold. Thank you.